When I came back from the market that day, I had no idea my life was on the verge of a transformation I couldn't have predicted. The morning seemed ordinary, or so I believed. I'd gone to the market to pick up groceries, buying the usual fruits, vegetables, and some snacks for the house. There was a sense of calm that often accompanies routine, but as I stepped through the door, I had no clue something unexpected was waiting for me. Walking into the house, I heard faint laughter coming from the living room. It was Jake, my stepson, and his friend Daniel. Jake had been living with us for a year now, and although he was a good kid, there was always a small barrier between us. Perhaps it was the difference in age, or the fact that he had lived without a father figure for so long. But today, as I walked in, there was something different. A strange, charged atmosphere. Jake sat on the couch while Daniel stood near the window, his back turned to me. Something about his stillness felt magnetic and hard to ignore. At first, I couldn't pinpoint it, but his stance made me uneasy, as though he was waiting for someone, or perhaps for me. "Hey, Mom, you're back," Jake called out, breaking the silence. I smiled and tried to shake off the unsettling feeling in my chest. "Yeah, just got back," I replied, setting the grocery bags on the kitchen counter. When I glanced toward Daniel again, I noticed he had turned to face me. His eyes met mine, dark and intense, and for a fleeting moment, a shiver ran down my spine. Yay, Mom. Just didn't feel like the right approach. "How was the market?" Daniel asked, his voice low, carrying an almost overly formal tone. "It was fine," I said, forcing a smile and attempting to brush off my discomfort. After all, he was just Jake's friend. I moved into the kitchen, but my mind kept returning to Daniel's unsettling stare. It was like his expression carried something almost predatory, though I dismissed the thought as ridiculous. He was just a teenager, and I was clearly overreacting. Why, as I put away the groceries, I heard faint whispers from the living room. Though their voices were barely audible, something about their conversation felt different. It was as if they were speaking about something they didn't want me to overhear. My curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself edging closer to the door. Through a small gap, I could see them sitting on the couch. Their body language had shifted. Jake, usually relaxed, appeared tense, while Daniel leaned in closer than felt appropriate. Though I couldn't make out his words, their interaction made my heart race. Before I could pull away, the door creaked, and Jake's startled eyes met mine. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked. Caught off guard, I quickly tried to appear casual. "Oh, nothing, just putting things away," I said, retreating. But deep down, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling growing inside me. It was as if I'd stumbled into a world where things were happening that I wasn't meant to see, a space I didn't know how to navigate. Later that evening, during dinner, the strangeness persisted. Daniel stayed, and while I tried to keep the conversation light, I couldn't ignore the tension in the air. His gaze lingered on me more than usual, each glance lasting just a little too long. His smiles seemed calculated, as though he was playing a game I couldn't understand. Later that evening, during the time we had, the strangeness felt oppressive. thick with unspoken intensity. "Do you need help with anything?" he asked suddenly, his voice smooth but low, sending a chill through me. "No, I'm fine," I replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. He stood and moved closer as I worked on the dishes. When he reached out to assist, his fingers brushed against mine. Though brief, the touch felt electric, and the air around us seemed to crackle. I instinctively stepped back, trying to collect myself. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said softly. His tone sounded sincere, but there was something beneath it I couldn't identify. "It's fine," I managed, though my breathing was uneven. I tried to dismiss the feeling, but something about him stirred an effect in me that I didn't want to acknowledge. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His presence, the way he looked at me, the way that fleeting touch had made my skin tingle. I knew it was wrong. He was too young and practically part of the family, but the attraction was undeniable, and the more I thought about it, the more dangerous it felt. Over the following days, the tension between us only grew. Each time Daniel visited, I tried to avoid him, but his presence was magnetic. He seemed to follow me with his gaze, his intensity unrelenting. I felt like there was an invisible force pulling us together, one I was powerless to resist. One evening, Jake was out with his friends, leaving Daniel and me alone in the house. The atmosphere was suffocating, heavy with anticipation, as though a storm were brewing. I busied myself with tasks, trying to ignore him, but he was everywhere, impossible to avoid. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and heavy with emotion. "I don't think you understand how I feel," he said, stepping closer. My heart raced, and I struggled to respond. His eyes bore into mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "You're not just Jake's mom," he said, his voice softening into a near whisper. "You're so much more to me." My chest tightened as his words hung in the air, and I couldn't find the words to respond. The days following that night became a blur of conflicting emotions and overwhelming confusion. It felt as though my entire world had shifted, leaving me trapped in a space I didn't want to inhabit. Whenever Daniel was nearby, the air seemed heavier, charged with a strange energy that I couldn't ignore. He was no longer just Jake's friend. He had become something far more significant, something I struggled to admit to myself despite my desperate attempts to suppress it. That evening, after Jake returned home, I worked hard to act as though everything was normal. I couldn't risk revealing what I was feeling, especially not with him around, but every time Daniel entered the room, my heart would race uncontrollably. No matter how hard I tried to stay composed, it was impossible to resist the pull he seemed to have over me. He had become the center of my thoughts, his every word and glance drawing me further and further away. As I relaxed into the belief that I needed him, that every time I entered the room, my whole world would be unharassed, drawing me further into the land. For several weeks, I simply repeatedly prepared for bed. Sleeping on the couch, Jake, perceptive as ever, started noticing the tension. He had a knack for picking up on subtle shifts in the atmosphere. During dinner one evening, as Daniel sat across from me, I felt the intensity of his gaze. His dark eyes were filled with emotions I couldn't begin to decipher. I looked away, but it was too late. Jake was already watching me closely. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I forced a smile, struggling to steady my racing heart. "Of course, just tired," I replied, but I knew he didn't believe me. Daniel said nothing, but his eyes stayed fixed on me, and I could sense he saw right through my lie. It was as if he was waiting for me to acknowledge the truth I was so desperate to hide. After dinner, I excused myself and retreated to my room, hoping that some solitude might calm my thoughts. But I couldn't escape the memory of Daniel's touch or the way his eyes had locked onto mine. I knew he wasn't going to let this go easily, and that terrified me more than I wanted to admit. As I lay in bed later that night, I heard soft footsteps on the creaky floorboards. It wasn't unusual. Jake often stayed up late, but this time the steps were slow and deliberate. Then the door to my room opened slightly. I froze, holding my breath. Was it Jake? But as the figure stepped into the dim light of the hallway, I saw it was Daniel, sitting up in bed. My heart pounded wildly. "Daniel," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he finally said, his voice low and intense. "You know that, right?" I wanted to say something, to push him away, to tell him this was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Looking into his eyes, everything I had planned to say disappeared, swallowed by the gravity of the moment. "You're Jake's friend," I whispered, though I knew even as I said it that the words weren't enough to stop what was happening. His lips curled into a faint smile, one that seemed to hold countless secrets. "I know," he replied softly, "but we both know there's more to this than that." A shiver ran down my spine as he moved closer. My mind screamed at me to push him away, to draw a boundary, but my body betrayed me. My heart raced as his fingers brushed against my cheek. "Daniel," I stammered, my voice unsteady, but he interrupted, his hand now resting gently on my neck, sending a wave of electricity through my skin. "Don't say anything," he whispered. "Just feel it. Feel what's between us." I wanted to resist, to tell him this couldn't happen, that it was wrong, but the pull was too strong. I felt his lips brush gently against my forehead, soft and tender. In that moment, the world around us seemed to disappear, leaving only the dangerous connection between us. Just as suddenly as it had begun, Daniel stepped back, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't decipher. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, as though he had just realized the weight of his actions. I sat there, breathless, as he turned and left the room, leaving me to grapple with what had just happened. For the rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were consumed by him and the undeniable reality of what we had shared. It felt so vivid, yet so wrong. What was I supposed to do now? The next day felt unbearably heavy. I couldn't even look at Daniel without feeling the fire burning in my chest. His presence was inescapable, lingering even when he wasn't there. And when he was near, my thoughts were a tangled mess. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I had to confront him, and end it before it spiraled even further out of control. That afternoon, I found him outside in the backyard, sitting on the porch steps with his head bowed, his posture tense, as if he knew what was coming. "Daniel," I said, my voice strained, "we can't do this. It's wrong." He didn't respond right away, but I could tell he was listening. "But I can't stop how I feel about you." Swallowing hard, I replied, "I don't want to hurt you, but this isn't something we can pretend is okay. It's not just about you and me. It's about everything we stand to lose." As I walked back inside, my heart was burdened with the knowledge of what I had just let go of, something I couldn't fully explain and might never truly understand. Turning a corner, I saw Jake standing in the hallway, his eyes meeting mine. In that brief moment, it felt as though he understood something irreversible. Even though it was over, the shadow of that night would linger forever.